The morning of January 22nd, 1943 was already hot by 9 o'clock, which is the only thing about Guadalcanal that never changed. Second Lieutenant John George settled into the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, adjusted the scope on his rifle, and began watching a banyan tree 240 yards away. He was 27 years old. He had 0 confirmed kills. The rifle in his hands was something he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy, and every officer in his battalion had spent 6 weeks making jokes about it. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. In the 72 hours before George climbed into that bunker, they had killed 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. 14 men in 3 days, and the battalion hadn't been able to locate a single shooter. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. The other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. When he had first unpacked the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer had wanted to know if it was meant for deer or Germans. George told him it was for the Japanese. They shipped out before the rifle even arrived, and George spent the entire ocean voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their guerans, while his own weapon sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle they kept laughing at. It weighed 9 pounds. The scope added 12 ounces. But the garand issued to every other man in his battalion weighed 9.5 pounds with no magnification, and fired 8 rounds on a semi-automatic action. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds, and required him to manually cycle the action between shots. Captain Morris had ordered him to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December of 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field and held it against everything the Japanese threw at them, but they had not cleared the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River, and they had not taken Mount Austin, a 1,400-foot jungle fortress the Japanese called the Gifu, defended by 500 men across 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th, fought for 16 days straight, lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded, and finally took the western slope on January 2nd. In all of that fighting, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times. The Point Cruz groves were different. No fixed fortifications, no bunkers, no open ground. Just massive trees, banyans with trunks 8 feet thick and canopies reaching 90 feet. And inside those trees, Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and learned to disappear. Some of them carried scoped Arisaka, Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle far better than any American unit that had been on the island for 3 weeks. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. But on January 20th, 2 men from L Company died during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more were killed. One of them shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had already walked past twice. The battalion commander summoned George that night and dispensed with formality. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria was. He needed someone who could actually find and hit a target at distance. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could do anything useful. George laid out his credentials without editorializing. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, 1939. 23 years old at the time. Youngest winner in the state's history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. George spent that night with his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in Cosmoline for the ocean voyage, and he cleaned it again regardless, methodical, Unhurried, each component examined. He checked the scope mounts. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee. Not a military ball, but the same cartridge the Garand fired. At dawn on January 22nd, he moved into position in the captured Japanese bunker that overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz, and he began to work. He had brought no spotter, no radio man, no backup of any kind. Just the Winchester, a canteen, and 60 rounds in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began glassing the trees through his scope. Nor the Lyman Alaskan ran at 2.5 power magnification, modest by any standard, but enough to pick up movement in the branches that would be completely invisible to the naked eye. The jungle was never truly quiet. Birds, insects, the distant percussion of artillery. George had learned to filter all of it and focus entirely on anything that moved when there was no wind to explain the movement. At 9:17 in the morning, a branch shifted, 87 feet up in the banyan tree, 240 yards out. No wind. George watched it, and then he saw the shape, a man in dark clothing, positioned in the fork where 3 branches met, facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies all morning. The Japanese sniper had been there since before dawn, completely invisible, completely patient, waiting for an American to cross his sight line. George adjusted the scope 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing, letting his body find the stillness between heartbeats. The Winchester's trigger had been adjusted at Camp Perry before the war, a clean, precise break at 3.5 pounds. He had spent hours on that trigger. Now he found out what it was worth. He squeezed it, the rifle kicked into his shoulder, and 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches in pieces, tumbling 90 feet before hitting the jungle floor near the base of the tree. George worked the bolt, ejected the casing, chambered a fresh round, kept his scope on the tree and waited. He knew Japanese snipers worked in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. He had killed the shooter, but the spotter was somewhere nearby, and in approximately 15 seconds he would be making a decision. At 9:43, George found him. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first, moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot, understood what it meant, and was trying to get out of the tree before whoever had just killed his partner found him. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the trunk. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both men were on the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled. He later wrote that in that moment, it felt no different from competition shooting, except that the targets shot back. He would find out how seriously he meant that at 11:21, or when a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from his head and sprayed dirt across his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a completely different direction from the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving back to his position, glassing the trees to the southwest with the same methodical patience. The shooter would have relocated after firing. That was basic doctrine. But in jungle, this dense, relocation options were limited. At 11:38, George found him. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up, repositioned to a different branch, but still in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the shape and fired. By noon, he had killed 5 Japanese snipers in less than 3 hours. Word moved through the battalion immediately. Men who had spent 6 weeks mocking his mail-order rifle now wanted to come watch him work. George refused every one of them. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. He spent the rest of the afternoon glassing trees and finding nothing. The remaining Japanese snipers had stopped moving in daylight after the 5th kill, which told him they were adapting, learning, paying attention. He returned to battalion headquarters at 1600 hours, and Captain Morris was waiting without a single joke in his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy, tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into soup and made the tree canopy invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited it out. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, visibility had returned enough to work. He spotted the first sniper of the day at 9:12, a Japanese soldier who had climbed into position during the downpour, using the sound of rain to mask his movement. Smart. He had chosen a tree 290 yards out, farther than any of the previous day's shots. Also smart. They were already calibrating to his capabilities. George compensated for the distance and fired. The sniper fell. Kill number 6. The response came at 9:57. Japanese mortars. They had enough information, muzzle flash or sound, or both, to triangulate his position in the bunker, and they used it. The first salvo landed 40 yards short. The second landed 20 yards short. George didn't wait to calculate where the third would land. He grabbed the Winchester and ran, they sprinting north along the tree line and diving into a shell crater as the third salvo hit. The bunker he had occupied for 2 days disappeared in a column of debris and smoke. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the crater, settled in, and resumed glassing. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew he was out there now. They were hunting him the same way he was hunting them. The dynamic had shifted entirely. This was no longer a man clearing a threat from concealment. This was a duel between professionals. At 2:23, George killed his 7th. At 5:41, he killed his 8th, a man who had climbed 94 feet up a banyan tree for maximum concealment, but created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed in the late afternoon. 8 kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, no 4 misses. That night, George sat with his rifle across his knees and worked through the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves, 8 dead, 3 remaining. Those 3, he understood with complete clarity, would be the best. They had survived longest for a reason. They had watched 8 colleagues die and drawn conclusions from every single one. They knew his approximate position. They knew his rifle. They knew he hunted alone, without a spotter, which meant he had a blind spot. He loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 in the morning he gave up and sat in his tent, watching the rain start again. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the time productively. He moved to an entirely new position, not the bunker, not the fallen tree, but a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December, a location the Japanese might not associate with him. He settled in and waited for the weather to clear. The rain slowed at 7:43. By 8:17, visibility was workable. At 8:17 on January 24th, George found the 9th sniper, positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, only 40 feet up. Low for a sniper. Unusually low. Every other shooter in the groves had climbed high for sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation, tucked into the palm fronds, in a way that would be completely invisible from ground level. But George wasn't at ground level. The rocks had given him elevation, and from that angle he could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head through the fronds. He began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. He had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The 3 who remained had been selected by survival. They were here precisely because they hadn't made elementary mistakes. This position was too easy, too obvious. A shooter in the palm fronds at 40 feet, perfectly silhouetted against the angle George was working from. It felt like it was meant to be found. George lowered the rifle and began scanning the surrounding trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. If the man in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for muzzle flash, waiting for the moment anyone took that easy shot. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, George found him. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up, hidden on 3 sides by branches and vines, with a clean sight line directly to George's previous position at the fallen tree. The Japanese sniper was watching the wrong location, waiting for George to appear there, or to take the shot at the decoy in the palm and reveal himself with the muzzle flash. George worked through the problem. If he shot at the real sniper first, the shot's origin would reveal his position before he could work the bolt and chamber another round. If he shot the decoy first, the real sniper would react to the sound, turn toward it, and create the fraction of a second of movement George needed. He aimed at the decoy, adjusted for wind, fired. The man in the palm fell. George swung the rifle toward the banyan at 91 feet and found the movement he had been waiting for, the real sniper turning toward the sound of the shot. And George fired before the turn was complete. The second man fell, his rifle tumbling through the branches after him. 2 shots, 2 kills, 10 total. But he had just announced his location to anyone else watching, and he had 4 seconds at most before something happened. He grabbed the Winchester and ran east along the rock line, dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away and pressing himself into the mud. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire tore through the rocks where he had been standing 6 seconds earlier. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving again. He relocated 100 yards east to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater and settled in with the water up to his chest, the Winchester resting on the crater rim. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. For the 11th would be the best, the most patient, the one who had drawn the most lessons from watching the others die. He was somewhere in the groves, and he had been watching George work for 3 days. George was still glassing trees at 9:47 when he made a mistake, a small one, but potentially fatal. He had been so focused on the canopy that he hadn't considered the ground. The 11th sniper was not in a tree at all. He was on the jungle floor, 30 yards south, moving through the undergrowth in a low crawl, using ferns and vines and fallen branches for cover, working his way parallel to the tree line toward George's last known position at the rocks. George saw the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. He stayed completely still in the water. The Winchester was shouldered, but the crater rim blocked his angle on the approaching man. Taking the shot would require him to rise up. Rising would expose him. He waited. Patience was the primary skill. Not shooting, not moving. Waiting for the right moment rather than forcing a bad one. At 9:52, the Japanese sniper stopped moving. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks and was studying them, searching for any sign of his target. He stayed there for 6 minutes. George stayed in the water for 6 minutes. At 9:58, the sniper started crawling again. 35 yards from the rocks. 30. 25. He was working along the exact escape route George had used during the machine gun attack, which meant he had been watching the machine gun attack, and he had read it correctly. He knew George had gone east from the rocks. He was following the logical evacuation path. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks and took up a position inside the old Marine machine gun nest, facing east, directly toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. He was 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, and his back was completely exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass. 38 yards. An elementary shot even without magnification. But he had been thinking about this man for 3 days, and the position made no sense. An experienced sniper who had survived while 10 others died would not sit in an exposed firing position with his back to the tree line. This was bait again. And if it was bait, the coverage would be positioned somewhere nearby. George kept the crosshairs on the man in the rocks, but expanded his attention to the surrounding area, scanning without moving the rifle. At 10:06 he found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. Not moving, not repositioning, just watching, rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch. 2 men. The 11th sniper had brought a partner, whether that was a second surviving sniper or a support element. George couldn't determine, and it didn't matter. He couldn't shoot both of them before they reacted. The bolt action required him to cycle the action between shots, and that gap was all it would take for them to locate him by sound and return fire. George lowered himself slowly in the water until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He held the Winchester vertically to keep water out of the barrel. He waited. At 10:13, the man in the rocks stood up. 10 minutes of watching an empty ditch had convinced him that George was farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner. Both men began moving east together, parallel, 70 yards apart, executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or walk directly onto his position. They moved past the crater. George could hear their footsteps in the mud, close enough that the sound was individual and distinct. Then they were past him. Their backs were to him. Both men were between George and the tree line. He rose from the water. Slowly, silently, water running off his uniform and his face and the barrel of the Winchester. He shouldered the rifle. The closer man was 42 yards away. George aimed, fired, worked the bolt. May swung toward the second man. The second soldier was already turning, already raising his rifle. George fired first. 11 shots, 11 snipers. The Point Crew's groves were clear. George climbed out of the crater and was retrieving his spent casings when he heard voices from the tree line. Japanese voices, multiple speakers, moving toward the fallen men. Not snipers, infantry. A patrol or recovery team, at least 6 soldiers by the sound of them, sent to collect the dead. George went back into the water, submerged to his eyes, held the Winchester vertical. The voices grew closer, stopped at the first body 42 yards away, then moved to the second. More conversation, urgent tones. Then they started moving again, not back toward the tree line, toward the crater. They had found the boot prints in the mud. George had been careful about sound and movement and concealment. He had not been careful about tracks. He had 5 rounds in the Winchester. 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt action under any circumstances. A Japanese soldier appeared at the rim of the crater and looked directly down at him. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George cycled the bolt while still submerged, rose up. 2 more men at the crater rim. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. He could hear shouting, more men moving toward him from the surrounding jungle. George came out of the crater on the north side and ran. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle around him. Not aimed fire, just volume, men shooting at sound and movement in the vegetation. George ran for 90 seconds and dropped behind a fallen tree. He glanced through the scope and saw 2 soldiers advancing on the crater, 50 yards out. He aimed at the lead man and fired. 1 dropped, the other dove for cover. 2 rounds left, and he could hear more voices flanking him from the south and east. They were trying to cut him off from American lines. He made the only rational decision available. A bolt-action rifle with 2 rounds was not a tool for fighting multiple infantry in dense jungle. He grabbed the Winchester and ran north, sprinting through undergrowth, vines catching his boots, branches across his face, Japanese fire following him through the trees. He ran for 90 seconds before dropping into a dry shell crater and listening. The voices were distant. They weren't pursuing. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock, water still draining from the barrel, 2 rounds remaining. His pack with the spare ammunition was somewhere near the water-filled crater. He began moving northeast through the jungle, staying low, using terrain for cover, not running, walking, controlled, the same patience he had applied all morning, now applied to getting home. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. He walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days, 12 rounds fired against snipers with 11 hits. Then the infantry engagement, 3 more kills, 5 rounds, 2 remaining. Morris asked about ammunition status. George told him. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it needed cleaning, mud in the action, water in the barrel. But it was functional. Morris told him to clean it and rest. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a problem. Japanese forces were beginning to evacuate Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would be gone within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent and spent 2 hours field stripping the Winchester. Cosmoline and gun oil, patches through the barrel until they came out clean, scope mounts checked, eye relief adjusted, 5 fresh rounds loaded. Then word came from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see him. George walked to headquarters expecting a negative report. Unauthorized independent operations, no spotter, failure to follow established tactical doctrine. But instead he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting, one of them Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had a single question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it required time, rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes, sniper weapons left behind by the Marines. Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. He wanted George to build a sniper section, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted on one condition. He was keeping the Winchester. Ferry approved without hesitation. Training started on January 27th. The 40 expert marksmen on paper, men who had qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards, but had never shot at a human being from concealment. George started with the fundamentals that competition shooting had burned into him over 2 decades. Breathing control, trigger mechanics, reading wind. The Springfield rifles with unertl scopes weighed 11 pounds, heavier than the Garand, and the weight made extended holds difficult. George taught them to use available support, rocks, logs, sandbags, whatever the jungle offered, because the jungle never offered a perfect shooting position, and a sniper who needed one would never take a shot. Range training lasted 3 days, stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, and then targets partially concealed by vegetation, simulating the conditions they would actually face. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 2-man teams, shooter and spotter, the spotter carrying binoculars and a Garand for security, with roles rotating after engagements so both men stayed proficient. On February 1st, he took 4 teams into the field west of the Matanikau River. George paired with Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground, overlooking a trail Japanese soldiers were still using for resupply. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed through binoculars. George fired. The man dropped. George worked the bolt, scanned for additional targets. Over the next 6 hours, his team engaged 7 more soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss on a difficult wind call. The other 3 teams reported comparable results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day, 0 American casualties. The sniper section ran continuous operations through early February. By February 9th, 74 confirmed kills, conservative counting, only targets where the body could be directly observed. George was operating near the Tambu Bay area on February 7th when a Japanese rifleman found him. The bullet struck him in the left shoulder, passing through muscle without hitting bone or major vessels, but the impact knocked him down, and Hayes had to drag him to cover while calling for a corpsman. The wound was serious enough to end his time on Guadalcanal, while he was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field, where surgeons cleaned the wound and sutured it, and told him 3 weeks minimum before returning to operations. He spent 2 weeks there instead. By February 9th, the Japanese had completed their evacuation. American forces reached the western tip of the island and found it empty. The Guadalcanal campaign was over. What had started as a desperate holding action in August of 1942 had become the first major American offensive victory in the Pacific, at enormous cost, but a victory. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days, 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. Colonel Ferry put him in for a Bronze Star, but George's war had more geography left in it. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered without knowing what he was volunteering for. By March, he was on a transport heading west across the Pacific. The Winchester, packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold, the Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth. Whatever Burma turned out to be, he assumed a man who could hit targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. 3,000 men total. A new unit with no official designation yet, modelled after the British Chindits, small mobile forces designed to operate deep behind enemy lines for weeks without supply support. Moving through terrain conventional forces wouldn't attempt, cutting supply lines, creating chaos, disappearing before the Japanese could mount a coordinated response. The men had a name for themselves already. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. Training took place in central India through the spring of 1943. Long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, operating without supply lines in conditions designed to replicate the worst the Burma jungle could produce. George modified his equipment for the mission. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but those had been operations with regular resupply and a base to return to each night. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles of jungle, with every ounce of weight carried on a man's back or a mule's. He removed the Lyman Alaskan and replaced it with a lighter, Weaver 330, same 2.5 power magnification, to 8 ounces lighter. He replaced the wooden stock with a synthetic version. The modifications brought the rifle from 9 pounds, 12 ounces, to 8 pounds, 14 ounces. Not dramatic, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every fraction of a pound accumulated. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the Myitkyina airfield, critical for Allied supply routes into China. Approaching overland through terrain the Japanese had determined was impassable for a force of any size. No roads, No supply lines, no artillery support, no motorized transport. Mountains and rivers and jungle so dense that visibility sometimes dropped to 30 feet. George's battalion began the march on February 24th, but the first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases climbed daily. Several pack mules broke legs on steep descents and had to be shot. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles and engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Quick skirmishes, ambushes, firefights, followed by immediate withdrawal. The Marauders were not designed to hold ground. They were designed to move and hit and vanish. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march, once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing, once at 380 yards against a machine gun position, once at 290 yards against a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, identifiably different from the sharp crack of a Garand, and one shot announced his presence to anyone paying attention. A second shot would give them time to locate him. He shot and moved immediately after every engagement, no exceptions. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. 700 miles of jungle. More men lost to disease than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus grinding through the unit in waves. The 5,300 men who entered Burma were down to fewer than 3,000, capable of fighting by the time they reached the objective. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation succeeded, but the unit was effectively destroyed by it. Too many casualties, too much time in the jungle without adequate medical support, too long operating past the limits of what the human body can sustain. George survived Burma. The Winchester survived. But the rifle that had cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days had been fired 7 times in 3 months of operations, because the Burma campaign almost never produced the conditions that required it. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in vegetation, where seeing 30 feet was optimistic. A scoped bolt action designed for precision at 300 yards was the wrong tool for most of what Burma demanded. George understood clearly, lying in a field hospital after evacuation in June of 1944, that the nature of the war was changing. Semi-automatic rifles were becoming standard. That the next conflict would be one with industrial volume, not individual precision. But that was an observation, not a complaint. He had done what he came to do. He was promoted to captain and assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he spent the rest of the war teaching infantry officers marksmanship and small unit tactics, how to move through jungle, how to identify targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He taught the lessons that had kept him alive from Point Cruz through the Hukong Valley in the practical, unembellished way of a man who had tested everything he knew against an enemy that was trying to kill him. He kept the Winchester. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, to Georgia, and it had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements. There probably more. After Burma, George had stopped counting. He was discharged in January of 1947. Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantryman Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton on the GI Bill, Politics, graduated with highest honors in 1950. Then 4 years at Oxford. Then 4 years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. Eventually, Washington, D.C., where he served as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, and later as a consultant at the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute, specializing in African affairs. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific. They didn't know about Point Cruz. They didn't know about the 11 snipers or the water-filled crater, or the 74 kills his section racked up in 12 days of operations. He didn't bring it up. In 1947, before the memories softened into something unreliable, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for publication, just for the record, while the details were still precise. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to more than 400 pages of clinical, technical documentation. Rifle mechanics, ammunition performance, ballistics under jungle conditions, tactics that worked and tactics that didn't, observations about Japanese weapons and Japanese doctrine drawn from first-hand experience that nobody else had bothered to write down. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and pushed for publication. George resisted. The book was too technical, too dry, too far from the kind of dramatic narrative that sold copies. The NRA persuaded him. The book came out in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger, and it quietly became one of the most important small arms references of the 20th century. It is still in print. It is still used by firearms collectors and military historians. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons from that period remain among the most detailed contemporary accounts that exist. George lived long enough to watch the United States fight 3 more wars. He watched the Garand give way to the M14, give way to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training programs, specialized equipment, and its own evolving doctrine. He watched the Army slowly learn the lessons that a state champion marksman with a mail order scope had demonstrated in the Point Cruz Groves in 1943, and then slowly formalize those lessons into an institutional framework. He had been ahead of all of it by about 20 years. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, where it sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like a vintage hunting rifle, which is exactly what it is. A civilian weapon that a man bought with 2 years of National Guard pay because he believed in what it could do, then carried halfway across the world to prove it against professionally trained military snipers operating in their element. The battalion that fought for 16 days and lost more than 300 men to take Mount Austin had not been able to clear the Point Cruz Groves in 2 weeks. John George cleared them in 4 days, alone, with 11 rounds, using a rifle his commanding officer had ordered him to leave in his tent. The rifle was a toy, Morris had said. George carried it anyway. Here's what the John George story is actually about. Not the rifle. The rifle was a tool, and tools are only as useful as the person holding to them. It's about the gap between what institutions assume and what individuals can actually do when they're allowed to operate according to what they know, rather than what the doctrine says. What the Army had no formal sniper program in 1943. It had no established tactics for counter-sniper operations in jungle terrain. It had no procedure for deploying a marksman independently against a specific threat. What it had was Captain Morris ordering George to leave his rifle in his tent, a battalion losing men at a rate that made 2 weeks of failure feel acceptable, and eventually a commander desperate enough to let a man with a mail order scope go prove something. George went into that bunker on January 22nd without a spotter, without a radio, without any of the support infrastructure that modern doctrine considers essential. He went because he could do the job, and he knew he could do it. And 4 days later, 11 Japanese snipers were dead, and the American soldiers moving through the Point Cruz Groves were no longer dying at a rate of 14 men per 72 hours. The institutional response was immediate. Colonel Ferry wanted a sniper section. wanted it trained, wanted it deployed. The lesson was obvious the moment someone was willing to learn it. The rifle sits in Fairfax, now in a museum case, silent. Most people walk past it. They don't know what it did, or where it went, or what kind of man carried it. They see an old hunting rifle behind glass and move on to something else. But the Winchester Model 70 that an armourer in Tennessee once asked was meant for deer or Germans was present for some of the most precise individual shooting in the Pacific Theatre. Fired by a man who packed it in a crate in Illinois, what waited 6 weeks for it to arrive on the other side of the world, and then carried it into a captured Japanese bunker at dawn and went to work. The army called it a mail-order sweetheart. John George called it his rifle. 11 Japanese snipers never called it anything at all.